So thanks everyone for coming along today. It's been really exciting hearing some of your questions about the kind of final stages of life we have here. Just to kick off, I just wanted to do an acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land from which I'm speaking today, and pay respects to their elders past, present and emerging. My name is Frankie Freeman. I'm the Education and Engagement Manager at COTA Victoria. One of my roles is to manage our information lifelong learning program, which seeks to make sure older Victorians can get access to the information that they need to support them in their ageing. And one of those areas which is of importance, or that we've seen become of importance to people, older people in Victoria, is some of these questions around the final stages of life. We did put out a little bit of a survey, and we got quite a few different questions from people. They kind of broadly covered three topics. One of them was funeral planning, one of them was will preparation, one of them was powers of attorney. So today we've got Kelly Scott from the Australian Funeral Directors Association, who I'll be passing to speak about the funeral planning aspects of things. I'll then jump in and do a little bit of a generic or answer to some of the more generic questions around will preparation. The powers of attorney questions that came through are probably best answered by our counterparts in Seniors Rights Victoria through their planning ahead sessions. But what we'll do is we'll put some links at the end about some more broader information resources that you can access on kind of all these topics. What I did want to acknowledge is that in the survey, if you're attending and you filled out some of those questions, some of the questions that we got were quite specific to do with people's individual circumstances. So we won't be able to get to answering all the questions in terms of the minute detail. However, at the end of the session, we're going to have a little bit of a Q&A, and if there is something that you want to kind of explore a little bit more and it's not necessarily specific, and we can be more generalist, we'll answer that. If not, we'll provide the information for our Ask COTA line, which will where you can give that a call or send us an email through that. And we can, have a discussion about your personal circumstances and try and point you in the right direction to get the information you need there. Again, just wanting to reiterate that this session, we're not financial or legal experts. So this is definitely from both Kelly and myself, the kind of more general advice. So, and if there's anything specific that you have queries about that does cross over in, I guess, to the legal or the financial situation, it's probably best to seek advice of a lawyer or a financial planner counsellor. But we will do our best to try and, at least signposts where you can find some more information if there's something that comes up that's particularly important to you. What I might do now is pass over to Kelly, who will be doing a little bit of a chat or a presentation on the funeral planning aspects of things. There's some really fantastic questions in this space. They were, very broad, and the presentation is really fantastic. So I've had a chance to have a look at it, and Kelly is obviously very knowledgeable in the area. So I'll pass it over to you, Kelly.
Oh, great. Thanks so much, Frankie. And thanks for having me with COTA, Victorian Seniors Rights Victoria. I understand it's, your job to promote, improve and protect the wellbeing of older people in Australia. And it's all about choice and transparency. So hopefully we'll touch a lot on that today, because I think it's a really important part of our lives to think about and to have that choice, as we're making those decisions for ourselves and sometimes for our families. as well. So as Frankie said, my name is Kelly Scott. I'm a fourth generation funeral director based in regional Victoria. So I'm here in Kyneton at the moment. And I'm also the national president of the Australian Funeral Directors Association at the moment. So I have two hats I'm wearing. But I'm often asked to do sessions like this in the community and for lots of different groups, because usually people find out that I work in funeral care, I'm inundated with questions. And a lot of them are the practical questions that people just want to know, those basic things that sometimes we take for granted that we assume everyone knows, and that's often not the case. So, it's a fact of life that, funerals are a part of our lives, and they've been a part of society's world for thousands of years since we began, and you only have to look to our First Nations people to see some of the incredible rituals they have around sorry and saying goodbye, which are absolutely beautiful and have been there for thousands of years. So it is an important part of the journey we all take in our lifetime. And that's why I guess pre-planning really does make sense, because there are so many decisions to make as we age and as we get older, that we want to make sure that we're doing the right things for ourselves and doing the right things for the people that we love. A lot of those decisions are because people are very practically minded, so they're thinking about financial planning and they're doing wills and powers of attorney. So sometimes these decisions and discussions come up at a time like this. Sometimes it's very practical. They want to, make the most of financial opportunities if they're putting money aside. Sometimes they're reducing tax, so they're making those decisions purely on a practical way. But a lot of the time they're emotionally influenced. And I think all of us, I often say when I'm meeting with families, we've all got families with all sorts of personalities, which is amazing, but it often means sometimes there's layers of that and there's difficulties and sometimes estrangements. And I would say, including our own, no one's exempt. And I don't think I've met a family in 35 years that doesn't have something going on underneath the surface. So it's part of our lives as well. And I think it shouldn't stop us from doing what we need to do, because we can actually work with those extra layers, because it is part of all of our lives. So first of all, foremost, I guess funeral planning isn't necessarily about prepaying a funeral or anything like that. It's just about having conversations and really opening it up with whoever that may be in your life. It might be close family and friends. It might be extended family. It might be your legal advisors or financial planners. But it's really about having the discussions, because we've found, and again, I've been doing this for over 30 years, when families have had those discussions before, it just makes it so much easier, because they're always guided by that. Oh, I remember Mum saying years ago that this is what she wanted, and just that relief of being able to follow those wishes. I can't underestimate, how important those things are for, a family that then have to make decisions when that time comes. So I think, it's about speaking openly and honestly about what's important to you. And sometimes I think we get a little bit sidetracked on those things because we're influenced by other people. And I think it's a really good time when we've got sound mind and we can think practically, without sometimes the burden of being really unwell. This is the time to do it, when we're very practically minded. And sometimes those discussions we have with families when they come in to do pre-planning, they are hilarious, because people go, oh, I don't want those flowers. I bloody hate them, So it's amazing. And they get to say what they want. And, we usually find when people are honest and have those conversations, they are followed. So it does really make a difference. A little background, as you can see from some of those older photos, our family business has been going for a long time, since 1938. So that's my lovely dad leading a deceased person outside of the Catholic Church. I think he was about 23 at the time. So he's the third generation and I'm the fourth generation. Our business is called TJ Scott and Son, but everyone says, well, where's the daughter? And
sorry, Kelly,
son relates to... Sorry?
Sorry, Kelly, just can't see your screen.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Apologies about that, everyone. So just, the second slide with a few photos on there, Steve, just showing our family and where we've come from. So, funerals traditionally, we're very religious based a lot of the time back when we first started. And of course, now funerals are anything anyone wants them to be. And there's a couple of pictures there of being outside and you know, being near the water and, you know, wherever a special place might be. So funerals today are a mixture of some traditional values, cultural and religious, and some are very alternative. You know, as long as it's legal, we can have a service anywhere people wish to have them. So it could be, you know, on a football field, on a golf course, in a shearing shed, in an art gallery. You know, there's so many options there. So, you know, it's important to think about, you know, those things in your life that speak to you and the things that you enjoy, because I think sharing that on such an important day can really give those we love something like amazing in actual fact. And when people do those sorts of things, when people come out of those services, they come and say, wow, that was incredible. And I never knew that about Bill, or I never knew that about Joan. And I think when we do those sorts of things, it's a real gift for people attending a funeral, when we've really had that pre-thought about what's important to us. The next slide talks about, why do we have a funeral? And, you know, I've often heard people say, I hate going to funerals. I'm not going to have a funeral. Just throw me in the ground, or I don't want a big public show for my funeral. And look, I certainly understand these sentiments, and that sometimes comes from a lot of their own experience. But our role as funeral directors and in funeral care is not to tell families to have a funeral, or they have to have a funeral in a certain way. It's our role to ensure that the funeral is meaningful, and that can look very different for a lot of people. And I think COVID taught us a lot about the importance of coming together and what that might look like. But in reality, you know, funerals they serve many purposes. They certainly help us to understand, and that's understanding the reality of what's happened. Sometimes that's really hard to grasp, especially if a death has been sudden. So accepting the reality of the loss, you know, and working through our responses to that loss is an important part of our life journey. And it helps us to move forward with that person still with us. It's not about letting go, in actual fact. They also help us to farewell. We need time to mourn the loss of a loved one, and that physical goodbye is only the beginning. You know, we need to share and have time to release our emotions and feelings. And I'm sure many of us who've experienced loss know that you can't keep it in. It will come out at some point. It might not be initially, it might be days, weeks, months, even years later. So these sorts of steps does help us on that journey to say farewell. They also enable us to remember, celebrate, and pay respect to someone that we love. And we go to funerals for all sorts of people. Sometimes we might not have known them that well, but we've had an engagement with them and they've really meant something to us. And, you know, you only have to see the reaction to people, like when Princess Diana passed away, that mourning all over the world for someone we never met. But we all need to sort of acknowledge those feelings of someone we're connected to in some ways. Sometimes it's not necessarily for the people that are our immediate family. It might be for close friends that become our family. And it's also an opportunity to get support from those around you. And that's probably one of the things I always talk to when people say, I don't want a funeral, I don't want anything. Families often come back and say, one of the issues we've had is when I go up the street, people don't know that's happened to our family because we didn't say anything and they don't know what to say. So sometimes providing that opportunity for people to come together, even if it's private, but it's with those closest people in your lives, it gives them that opportunity to see you for the first time. And then the second time they see you, it's that little bit easier, because we all get a little bit anxious about what's the right thing to say. You're scared about saying the wrong thing. So coming together for a funeral, sometimes it's just giving someone a hug, and it's worth 1,000 words. You know, when people don't know the right thing to say, it's just being there and being there for them. So there's a lot of positive things about coming together at that time, because we all, you know, often need that support and that and sharing that journey, you know, together with other people. So as I said, a funeral can be in a church or a chapel, a hall, reception venue. It could be on the beach, in a park. It can be anywhere. It can be private. It can be with 2 people, 20, 200, 2,000. It doesn't matter about how many people are there. We approach that service in exactly the same way. So, you know, I think that's another thing COVID changed for people, when they sometimes felt they had to have something public or something big because traditionally that's what they did. And then when we were limited, they actually went, oh, this is actually more what I would like. I just wanted these very few people that mean the most to me to come together and have that opportunity. So, you know, it's about saying what is important to me, and I'll come back to that a lot. Look, and a funeral can be a celebration of life. It can be a time of reflection, a time of gratefulness, the time shared. It can reflect our beliefs and our values, and it can be quiet and sad, and sometimes it's a mixture of all those things. Sometimes we have funerals for people we've had difficult relationships with, and sometimes we're sharing a grief of a relationship that it wasn't what you wanted, or it wasn't what it should have been, but you still need to have that acknowledgement of that relationship. So there's a lot of layers involved in grief, and sometimes that is part of that funeral experience as well that we need to be aware of. And sometimes as a funeral care specialist, you know, we can help around that and what that might mean for people, because for some it's not always, when we say about celebrating a life, for some it's not that. It's something very different, and it's really good to be aware of those things that are important to people. But the main thing to remember is it's unique, and they aren't the same, and they shouldn't be the same for everyone. It should be really different for each person, because the funeral should be as unique as the person is. So it's not about, you know, telling people what we think, and I don't even use the word funeral director as much anymore, because I feel like that's directing people in a certain way, and in actual fact we're there to listen and there to support people's choices, whatever that might look like, and involving the family as much as possible in those decisions, because I think people think, oh, they don't have as much say or as much hands-on work. But our family started our business in a time when family members would stay at home for a longer period, and our work was much more perfunctory. We weren't organising an event like we do now. It was loved ones would be cared for at home by the community, and, you know, we were the old-fashioned word, the undertaker, that would be undertaking the role of looking after the deceased person and transporting them from the place of death to the funeral, and those sorts of more perfunctory things, logistical things. And now we find families are sort of going back to that and want much more control over that time, especially that time when a person's died. So, you know, those things are really important. And moving on to now, you know, why do we need a funeral director? And I'm often asked that question, and the shorter answer is you don't. You don't need a funeral director. There's no law in Australia that says you must use a funeral director. So, you know, it's important to know that, because, you know, some families, you know, prefer to do those things themselves. It's just like anything, I suppose, in our lives, that sometimes we do need help and support when we're doing something so important. So, you know, often, you know, in our role, people say we do lots of things, and we'll go through a little bit of that role, but they'll say, oh, we couldn't have got through that without you, only because there are so many decisions to make, even when it's very simple. So our role is to support that process. So there's lots of regulation, legislation that we fall under, that we need to make sure that we're following. But, you know, there's lots of things that governs burial and cremation that we need to be aware of. So sometimes that's, you know, a little bit too much for families. There's lots of other things they're thinking about at the time, rather than what paperwork we need to fill out and how we get those forms and who we submit those to and that sort of thing. So at the very basic level, you know, it's just doing all those important things that are required by law, most importantly. But funeral directors offer specialised services to help families through, as I said, not only the physical and logistical things involved, but also the emotional strain. And sometimes, I was saying to Frankie before, our role is almost unofficial mediators to make sure that, you know, everyone that needs to be involved in that process is listened to, even when there's one decision maker. And we'll talk a little bit more later about that. But to me, it's an important community service, and that's what my grandfather always instilled in us, is that our work is very much community focused and what our community needs. So, you know, some people choose not to have a farewell or a service for family and friends, which you might have heard is often called a direct cremation, because there's no legal requirement to have a gathering. And again, I think sometimes people think that gathering has to be quite big or formal. Some people still think you have to have a gathering in a church and it has to be advertised, and that's not the case. So sometimes when people take away those they think that's going to be a burden. When you come back to the basic things, they actually are quite relieved to think they can have something small and intimate. And sometimes the loveliest gatherings we've seen are those very small and intimate gatherings. So the very basic requirement that we need to organise at the time is a medical certificate needs to be completed by a doctor, or the coroner's court is involved when a death is sudden or unexpected. So either way, we need some paperwork to say that a person has died. So we help organise that to be completed and organised. We also have to have someone, someone has to take responsibility for looking after the deceased from that time that a person's died to the time that they're going to be buried or cremated. So a lot of the time they are in our care and we're looking after them. Sometimes, again, families prefer to do that, or sometimes we do that in partnership with families. So a loved one might be at home for a period of time, and then they'll come to us for some specialised care and support. So we do that hand in hand with the family and what they're comfortable with and what they would prefer to do. And basically, by legislation, the deceased must be presented, especially in Victoria, to the crematorium or cemetery in a regulation vessel, which is an enclosed container. And that's open to interpretation, and there's certainly more questions about that. But there are certain requirements that we work under, and that is one of them, that people come presented to the cemetery or crematorium in an enclosed container. The person's death, of course, must be then registered in the state that they have passed away, and that's with the state's births, deaths and marriages. So again, that's a bit of a process, but once that's registration's done, that's part of completing the registration of death in that state, and then a death certificate, the official death certificate for births, deaths and marriages is then issued. So, we've found that we help with all of those logistical things, but it's that coming together and what that might look like that's also an important part of our role. But I always say to people, my view still is the most important thing we do is look after the person who's died and make sure they're treated beautifully, with care, with dignity, and to help families have time if they need to have time with their loved one for the last time. And that can be really important. And there's lots of sometimes specialised care that we need to help someone, so a family can come in and do that. So that's a really important part of what we do, in addition to organising, a gathering of some description. So moving on to, what we do, I think families sometimes come to us because they need help to navigate the options. As I said, you can see on the screen there, this is, the basic things that we do. But, for a gathering, we can sometimes plan and coordinate up to 20 different suppliers that might be involved in that goodbye. And sometimes that's really simple, like organising flowers, a celebrant, organising equipment hire, audiovisual needs, catering. Live streaming now is very, very popular for families that are, far and wide. So we help with all of those things, and as I said, and most importantly, the care of the person after they've died, from the time of death until the time of the funeral. And as I said, sometimes families are involved, whether that be at home or they come in to our premises or the funeral director's premises, and they help in that care and a part of that care, which is lovely if that's what they choose to be. So we guide and support families through as much as possible, and we help them with as much or as little as they need from us. Some are very hands-on, and some are like, I can't even think about putting together a photo tribute. Can you do that for me? So we very much listen to what they need and support them in that way. One of the questions that came through to Frankie was moving on to, what to expect when you meet with a funeral director or a funeral care specialist. And if we go to the next slide, thanks, Steve. What do we need at this time when you meet with someone? And as I said, there's some logistical and legislative information that we need. So we need quite a bit of personal information about the person, and most of that is for the registration of death. A lot of people aren't aware, then you go, why do you need our parents' names or our marriage details? And that is to submit to births, deaths and marriages, and often they cross-check that against certificates that they already have in the system, such as birth and marriage certificates and birth of your own children. So we need things like parents' names, their occupations, marriage details, children's names, dates of birth. So we need quite a bit of information, and it helps sometimes to have those things ready. At a time of grief, even basic information you'd know any other day of the week, people go, oh my goodness, I can't remember. I need to, and then they get stressed, and it's actually, there's plenty of time to get that, but that's something that we do help with. We also ask for clothing and a care plan, because as I said, that care of someone who's we're looking after is very important, and we like to think about what that person might be dressed in, what might be placed with them in the coffin or casket as well. So we often say, when you're coming in to meet us, think about bringing those things in with you. And then we also talk about your instructions, what the family needs to say farewell, and what that goodbye actually might look like. Another one of the questions that came through, moving on to the next slide, is what decisions have to be made? And as I said, there's quite a few, even when it can be quite simple. So here's just an overview of just some of the things that we go through with the family, and some of the things that you might think about and talk with your families about. Number one, with regard to the service options, where would that be? Is it indoors or outdoors? Will it be a private or a public gathering? Will it be advertised, or will it be held just with a few close family and friends? Will it be a burial or cremation? Now, at the moment in Victoria, our legislation only allows for earth burial and fire cremation, but water cremation is available in a couple of other states in Australia, so that's certainly coming. And, there's information and studies going on now about natural organic reduction, which is like composting. So we're looking into those options as well, because if families want those options, we need to make sure that they are available. So there's studies going into those sorts of things now. But at the moment, it is earth burial or fire cremation that we have a choice of. You might think about who's going to lead the service, even if there's only a couple of people there. Sometimes it's that person that takes that pressure off them, that's just going to lead us through. Even when a service is very organic and not too formal, sometimes it's nice to have someone to help you along. We always need to think about the type of, as I said, the vessel that we place a person in for that burial or cremation, and every funeral director will have lots of options there. So again, those decisions sometimes are really perfunctory. They go, this is just for that purpose. I don't want anything flash. I just want something basic. For some, they'll choose something that's an image-wrapped coffin with beautiful, images on there of a favourite place, or we had a lady that had used to show her dogs, and we had photos of all her dogs on the coffin, so I went with her. So for some people, that's an important decision. For some, that's not the important decision. How we notify family and friends. We certainly have noticed a difference since COVID. We have less notices in the newspaper going in, and that's certainly a cost factor as well. A lot of people use their own social media or use online tributes like we have, and most funeral directors do have. So, that's something to consider. And some people don't put anything in. Of course, they leave that private. You think about flowers, mementos, ways of personalising a service, more sustainable options also is something to consider. So there's lots of decisions to make, as I said, even when it's quite simple. A few questions that came forward that I'll talk to about now. Someone said about, what are options for more greener funerals to be more sustainable? And there's certainly a lot of things you can think about now to have less of a footprint on the environment. And it's not just choosing a more environmentally sustainable coffin or casket or shroud. It might be thinking about, well, can we have a service outdoors where we don't use any electricity or air conditioning or lights? And using, going to a place that's the closest cemetery to you because you're using less fuels. I mean, just those basic decisions I know people have made to be more sustainable. Not putting in the newspaper because they don't want to contribute to the print and printing of paper. So those little things also make a difference to, having less of a footprint. And certainly in mortuary care, that's a family decision as well, because embalming is a choice. and it's not always required. And I know we, choose natural body washes and shampoos and conditioners to, again, just those little things each and every day that we do, have less of an impact. So they're important things. If the environment is, really important to you, it's really good to note those that you would prefer to have as a smaller imprint, a footprint as possible. So those are really important decisions to make. Options for religious services was another question that came through. Most families, most ministers and priests certainly understand that not all families are connected to church and religion now, even though the person we're doing the funeral for is. So sometimes they might not want the full service, like a full communion service. And they can certainly offer something a little bit more low-key, so maybe just a prayer service rather than having a full requiem mass or service in a church. And saying that, there are some ministers and priests that are very traditional and you don't get that choice. So that's an important conversation we have with families when they choose the place a service might be. We'll say, look, this priest doesn't allow eulogies, for example, or photo tributes, and it has to be this. And a family might say, that's absolutely fine. That's exactly what such and such would want. Or they'll say, no, we want to have more flexibility, and they'll choose another option. So again, those sorts of decisions are really important about how much, you might want to incorporate some religious or faith element, and whether that's with a minister or not. You can certainly bring that sense of faith and spirituality into a service that is not necessarily, in a church. Another question that came through about cremated remains was regarding a lot of Christian religions. Many years ago, it wasn't really an option, especially for Catholics, to be cremated. And of course, now it is. I think they even brought out a brochure themselves to say Catholics can be cremated. So there's certainly no limitations on that choice now. And once a person has been cremated, their cremated remains can be placed anywhere. They don't have to be placed in a sacred place, like in a church ground or anything like that. That's just an individual choice. So there's no obligation as far as religious. If you have to have ashes in a certain place after you're cremated, but it's certainly an option for a lot of those Christian religions that traditionally preferred burial. That's really now something in the past. And another question that came through was about low-cost options. We'll certainly talk about funeral costs and things as we go through. But, I always suggest sitting down as a family before you meet with your funeral director to say, okay, what we've got is this amount of money for this service. And we need to stick with that and have a budget in mind. As a family, before you're under any or feel under any pressure, you should never be under pressure to make decisions that, number one, can't be afforded or not right for your family. But I think if you take that time before you meet as a family, think about what are the important things and what are the things that aren't so important, or what are the things that we can do for ourselves. Those decisions are really important. And another question that came through was about donation of your body and organs, and that's done separately to a funeral director. So we might put some information up about that afterwards because there's a little bit to follow. But in Victoria, if you wanted to donate your body to science, you would contact the University of Melbourne Department of Anatomy and Neuroscience. They have a body donor program, and that's done separately to a funeral director. And certainly donating organs is a decision you also have to make before that time comes. So if anyone's interested in donating their body or their organs, those decisions and certain things have to be put in place well before a person has died. So moving on to who makes the decisions, and this will come under, we're talking about wills and powers of attorney. We can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Steve. One of the most important things we see when we're arranging a funeral is who is in control, who makes the decisions for the deceased. And it is the executor of the estate who's responsible for making the decisions for the funeral. You may have powers of attorney during a lifetime. They cease once a person has passed, and then the executor takes over as your voice after you've died. So it's really important. I probably couldn't stress more that the importance of having a will, because unfortunately, you know, in the 30 years I've been looking after families, a lot of issues will come out of there being no one designated to be that person responsible. So they do have the responsibility of carrying out someone's wishes as outlined in their will. If there's no executor or will, the court will issue a grant of letters of administration if required, and that's usually made to the next of kin of the deceased. And again, you need legal advice and support around making those decisions. But certainly we see having a will makes that process so much easier. And it's not about that person is the only person who comes in to arrange a funeral. We can arrange a funeral with 20 members of a family. We listen to everyone's ideas and suggestions. And if in agreement, they can all be carried out. But usually it's that one person responsible for signing off on that and agreeing to all those decisions. So I certainly recommend legal advice to ensure that your will is correct and as it should be, because that person or those people are your voice after we've gone. And sometimes it's not necessarily the eldest child or the youngest. It's whoever you know will be your voice and the one that will carry out your wishes. And sometimes that's not necessarily your immediate family. It might be someone that's in your extended family or a very close friend that's willing to take on that role. But yes, I certainly would encourage you to get legal advice around your will to make sure that your wishes are carried out. So moving on to, what does having a funeral mean? And as I said, it's not necessarily about having a large public service. It sometimes is a very quiet, intimate, private gathering of people just to come together and share. It's about saying goodbye, but in whatever way that is appropriate for that person, and that can look very different for different people. And whether it's a non-attended cremation or an intimate gathering of family, a private funeral, or a public funeral with hundreds of people, they're all just as important as the other. So we certainly, as I said, put the same amount of planning into a funeral service, whether it's for 2 people or 2,000, it's just as important. And ultimately, it's up to you. And I think that's the most important thing to remember. And I know we're going through this very quickly, but we'll move on to why pre-plan and why you should think about having those discussions, because we certainly have seen, I don't think there's one funeral that I've looked after in 35 years where families come and the person that they've come to see us about who's died, who's made some pre-planning or told people what they wanted, not one family member said, gee, that was a waste of time. I wish they hadn't have done that. Usually it's, wow, I'm so glad that mum or dad made those decisions, because there's still little things that they're going to be involved in to, you know, be part of that. But knowing they're following their loved one's wishes just takes that burden away from them, that stress, thinking, am I making the right decision? I'm not sure, because years ago they said they wanted to be cremated, and then recently they said they wanted to be buried, and sometimes that can cause some confusion. So pre-planning, even if it's just having those conversations, does make it easier for those who will be acting on your behalf. Nominating the authorised person, as I said, is essential. And even if it's not anything formal, discussing your wishes with your loved one eases that decision-making at the time, and then they can follow your lead. And often when I'm looking after a family and one person, oh, I really want this and the other, and they're both coming from a beautiful place because they both want something lovely. And if I feel like they're getting to a point where they can't say, okay, what we might need to think about is, let's go back to what mum would want. Oh, yeah, look, she'd probably want this. And again, that sort of eases their burden of making that decision and not being 100% sure about what that might be. So discussing your needs as a family or support care group, it teases out, you know, what you may need at the time. So having those discussions, as I said, when people are well and happy and sort of almost you can do it in a lighthearted way, you know, rather than having that burden of coming together at a time when someone's died, which is, you know, you're dealing with grief on top of that. Sometimes making these decisions and having these conversations now can be done in a more lighthearted way. And as I said, sometimes when we're talking with families beforehand, they can really be quite funny about what they want, and it can lighten that sort of situation. But it certainly minimises family turmoil and certainly family differences. That's, as I said, it's always going to be there. It doesn't go when a person's died. It doesn't make it easier or any more difficult. It's certainly, I think, it helps them follow just some guidelines as they go through. Investing in a funeral bond or something like that, there's practical things that can help maximise pension entitlements and have some tax advantages, but not everyone wants to put money aside for those sorts of things. And as I said, it's not necessarily the case that you need to do that, but it does alleviate the decision-making for loved ones. And it certainly helps someone, feel more in control at a time sometimes when they don't feel in control. Moving on to what does pre-planning look like? Pre-planning, again, means different things to different people. If we can move on to the next slide. Thanks, Steve. It might be just, discussions with your family, your lawyer or executors of your wishes, and noting them, might be putting them in your wills. It might be noting them with a funeral director. So, there's many reasons why, you can do it and should. And as I said, they're going back to the approaching retirement. Often people are thinking about these sorts of decisions when they're doing estate planning, powers of attorney and wills. Moving on to the next one. Thanks, Steve. And we'll just get through the last bit because they certainly can ask any questions later on if you do have any. But that's what pre-planning looks like. It's what you need it to be. Sometimes people like to put money aside to cover expected costs. Sometimes it's just about making those decisions and having a discussion with the important people in your life. Moving on to the next slide. There are different pre-planning options, and I won't go into all of them in depth now, but look, there's a great booklet through ASIC that talks to these different pre-planning options. And I think that's a really good resource. It's not done by funeral directors. It's not done by Centrelink. It's done by ASIC, and they've looked at all these different products in the market to see what are the advantages and what might be right for you and what might not fit your plan. So certainly if you can get hold of that booklet by ASIC, I would certainly recommend having a look at that. We'll just go through the next one really quickly. Funeral bonds is when you just put money aside towards your funeral. It doesn't contract you. There's not necessarily anything in writing about that, but you just want to put money aside, and often that's done for financial reasons. So it certainly protects loved ones from the financial stress of organising a funeral if there is money sort of put aside, for sure. That can certainly be connected with pre-planning funeral decisions, but the funeral bond is portable. If you happen to move, you just take that with you to, the funeral director that you choose. So you're not tied into anything. We often find sometimes with prepaid funeral contracts, people feel they're set in one thing, and our decisions can change over time. So this is very portable and can be changed, as you change your decisions. Moving on to prepaid funerals. These are more things that are done with your funeral director. You decide on the funeral that you want. There's some things that can be prepaid at today's costs, and you won't see any increase in those costs. So the funeral directors can usually prepay their costs, the professional service fee in the coffin. Of course, they can't prepay or guarantee costs of third parties such as catering and cemeteries and that sort of thing. And often a prepaid is done in conjunction with a funeral bond, so you're putting money aside for those third parties. And moving on to funeral insurance, it's really important to be aware that funeral insurance isn't a saving plan. It is just insurance. And there's a lot of research done about that and the benefits, and sometimes some of the things that haven't been so helpful for families. So, of course, if you miss payments, your insurance is cancelled. So it's really important to understand that it is an insurance policy. It's not a savings plan. And again, referring there to that ASIC Paying for Funerals booklet that actually has some really good examples of people's experience with funeral insurance. So certainly consider that carefully before you take that on. Sometimes you're better off just putting set money aside every week or every month that you know will go towards, you know, your funeral expenses. Moving on to why pre-planning. Pre-planning does make it easier for the ones you love. There's certainly no doubt in my experience that having those decisions made at such a hard time makes it so much easier. For a lot of people that come in and pre-plan with me for themselves, it gives them peace of mind. They like to know that they're organised and that their family will be helped through this, or they might not have immediate family close by that they're able to rely on. So they want to make sure that this is done for their executor and that everything's put in place. It also helps people feel more in control because they might have had experiences with funerals and they're very certain about what they do and what they don't want. So it's about, you know, making those decisions for yourself. And as probably someone who likes to be in control of, you know, a lot of the time, I like to make those decisions for myself. So it does make it easier. And of course, pre-planning investments, they're easy to organise and they can be paid in a lump sum or done by direct debit if you do want to put money aside. Moving on to probably what most people want to know is, what do funerals cost? And of course, it's probably like anything. How much does it cost to build a house, or how much does it cost to go out for dinner? And it really depends on your choices. And it's really, really important, if you've got that time and inclination to do that research, is finding out, you know, what's important to you and getting quotes. Don't ever think that a funeral director will think it's odd if you're asking what a funeral costs before you make decisions. In fact, we actually expect it now, and most families do. So don't ever feel like, oh gosh, we can't talk about money because we're organising a funeral. In actual fact, I usually find people feel more at ease that we're having those conversations, and prices are transparent. Just for your information, we've just recently passed a bill in Victoria that would require funeral directors to have their costs on their website to make it as transparent as possible. We already do, because other states have that legislation in place. And a lot of funeral directors will already have their cost booklets on their website to make it easily accessible for people to see and be able to compare. So there's basically 5 cost components of a funeral: the professional service fee of the funeral director, and that will depend on what we're organising for you and the time and the resources involved. As I said, some funerals are very simple and some are quite involved and might be over several days. The coffin or casket cost and what you choose for a loved one to be placed in. Cemetery and crematorium fees will differ from cemetery to crematorium, and certainly more expensive in metro areas than in the country. And of course, then there's other options to personalise the funeral and other third-party things such as catering, which I know is probably one of the things that increased the most in most recent times due to the cost of living, which affects all industries, including funerals, because we organise so many separate supplies as part of that funeral. So on average, I always say it's probably between $9,500 and $11,000 for a funeral, but it can be a lot less and it can be a lot more. So again, it's up to you and what your priorities are. So really important to have a look at those things, what's important to you. Making decisions about, I think, setting a budget is really important and clever, and that keeps everyone in the family on the same page as well, and having those open conversations. Don't ever shy away from it. I always encourage families, and you know, when they're ringing, we often get calls saying, oh, can you give me an idea of how much a funeral is? We send out no obligation quotes. Every funeral director will do the same. You know, if I want my service at this church followed by a burial, how much will that cost? And comparing that, because even though funeral directors, sometimes you're not comparing apples and apples, service quality can be quite different. So, you know, take the time, if you can, to look around and get that advice. Some questions on the next slide, Steve, to ask about cost. And again, I encourage you to do so. Every funeral director will encourage these questions and help you with them. And most importantly is to take your time when choosing someone to help you that you're comfortable with. You've got to be comfortable with that person so you know you can ask these questions. As I said, service quality is not necessarily the same. Some more online businesses don't meet with families in person, whereas we think that's essential to making families feel comfortable. But questions to be asked, I think, that are really important is, you know, will my loved one be dressed and cared for? Some don't do that. Is embalming required? What are the more natural options? Where will my loved one be when in the care of the funeral director? I always encourage people to go, they need to know where their loved one is. Are they here with me in Kyneton? Where are they? So I think those decisions are really important. And of course, can we spend time with a loved one before the funeral and having that opportunity to not necessarily having a viewing, sometimes that's not for everyone, but even just being with the coffin at a quiet time before the day of the funeral itself can be really helpful for a family. Moving on to the last slide, I think we're just about. I'm proudly an AFDA member. What many people don't realise is funerals aren't regulated in Australia. So the AFDA members, we are a professional body formed in 1935, and we actually have premises of vehicle and equipment are standards that we must maintain to be members, and that's not always the case for funeral directors. So in the absence of regulation, we self-regulate and make sure families we serve experience the best possible care. So we're the largest association in Victoria, in Australia, and we have members in every state and territory. And we're bound by a very strict code of ethics and practice designed to meet community needs. So I've just put on the next page a little helpful book, couple of booklets that there's a link there that you can go and get those online. They're Your Goodbye booklets, and they are a little compendium of information of where to start making all sorts of decisions and thinking about things. And I think they're a great way to start if you're thinking about, well, where do I start? How do I start? What are the decisions I have to think about? And I think COTA Victoria have just put that link on there for everyone to have a look at. So one is about putting those decisions in writing. And what I love about the other book is about starting your story and sharing a story. And when we first got these books here, we actually took these books away camping with our kids and started these questions inside and talked to them about each other. Sometimes it's, what's your earliest memory? And you know how many times we don't think about those conversations, and oh my goodness, it opened up a whole world. So certainly do yourself a favour and get hold of that. Having those conversations now is wonderful and lovely to share those experiences together. So I think that's all from me. I know I've talked a lot, but you're very welcome to ask questions to me. There's contact details through COTA and certainly through Frankie. So thank you very much, everyone, for having me, and I hope it's been helpful on your journey, and I hope it just encourages you to think for yourself and make your decisions, and don't be afraid to make them.
Thank you so much, Kelly. That was super informative. I learnt a lot from that. There was definitely some questions that before we got sent through I wouldn't have even thought to ask, and there was even more points that you raised there, which, yes, stuff to start thinking about the process. And I'm also someone who likes to be prepared and whatnot, so some of this was very relevant for me in terms of liking to have that stuff done beforehand. Just in essence, is to try and save some time, what I'm going to put in the chat box now is two links. One's to a guide to making a will in Victoria, and one is COTA Victoria's Death of a Partner booklet, which shares some of the practical information about, the death of a partner booklet in particular is essentially a template to go from, when your loved one's kind of passed away to, the things that you have to think about, and answer some of the questions that we did get online. Also now, if you have any questions that you want answered, if you want to put them in the chat box just while I'm answering some of the questions about wills, that would be great, just because I won't harp too much on some of the questions now because we are just running a little bit behind. So Steve, could you put up the slide for me, please? So the will one, I won't go into the what is a will, but this one here, which is what happens if you die without a will. So was touched a little bit on by Kelly. Basically, it means or the term is that you've died intestate. I'm probably not saying it correctly, but that's how I'll pronounce it. But basically, the laws of the state where you reside will determine how your property is distributed. That includes, bank account, real estate, all your other assets. Super is a little bit different. Again, what we recommend is getting some advice about your superannuation some legal advice if that's something that you want to have a conversation in terms of your will. But basically, if you do not make a will, there's a lot of different things that will be affected by that. So there's quite a flow-on effect, whether it's to do with your funeral or your estate generally. So that's one of the things where we say, if you can, make sure you make a will. There's a lot of questions about, are there any free services that will support that? Unfortunately, not at this time. There's some low cost services, whether it's a DIY will kit, in that link that I've shared called, I believe it's called Guide to Making a Will in Victoria. It will give some options there. There's also some options related to the state trustee as well. But yes, like I said, I'll point you in a direction to that guide that I've put in there. Next question I'll ask, which is on the next slide, Steve, is are there any limitations on who I can leave my estate to? So I took this question in kind of two ways. One is people, wanted to know if they could leave their estate to anyone, or was there people that they could exclude? So in terms of the exclusion side of things, how I guess it's written legally, there is an expectation that you'll look after your dependents in your will if they need the help and you have the resources. Essentially what that means is, even if you have adult children or a partner, if you don't clearly exclude them on your will, that could open up your will to be challenged. Again, not legal advice from me here, but just a kind of a generalist perspective of, if there is someone you want to exclude, you have to make it really clear in your will if they are classed as your dependent family member, that kind of thing. Otherwise, it could your will could be open up to a challenge. The flip side is, can I leave my estate kind of anyone, or anywhere, anyone? Depending on, there's probably a couple of things there. So there's some restriction on leaving properties to certain entities. So, for example, a charity or a foreign national, if you're going to leave your property to a charitable organisation, there might be some specific legal requirements that need to be met for you to do that. Or if you're leaving property to an individual who lives outside of Australia, there might be tax implications, or you might need to comply with foreign inheritance laws. So again, this is something that we would say you should probably seek professional legal advice about if you are looking at going outside the norm of who people would normally or generally leave their estate to. Again, there's some information in that wills booklet, but also some of the conversations around the aspects of probate and whatnot are touched on in the death of the partner booklet as well. And kind of the last question that popped up for us was, in terms of this section, was, does an inheritance impact on support payments like DSP? So that's regarding on if you have someone that you were leaving an inheritance to in your will, but they're on the disability support pension or another, government allowance. So the inheritance itself, again, this is not financial legal advice, so just as generally, the inheritance itself is not included in the income test. However, it may be included in the asset test. So for something like a pension, there's kind of four tests in terms of eligibility. One is obviously the age test with the pension, then there's the residency test, but then there's two other tests, which is the income and the assets. So inheritance could impact the assets part of that. So if you use the inheritance, or the person that you've left the inheritance to uses it on an exempt asset, that shouldn't be affected under the assets test. So that could be a principal home, so the place where they reside, their mortgage or medical equipment. But if they buy a non-financial asset, or they invest money in a way that excluded from the asset test, that could affect those payments. So again, really important to have a discussion with the relevant professionals about these kind of things. One of the things that we suggest is, particularly if the person that you're leaving your inheritance to is, about to, be eligible for the age pension, is to have some of these conversations well before they reach that eligibility age, because particularly with a financial planner or a financial counsellor, because setting yourself up or your financial matters up in a way that minimises either the tax burdens or your, how your asset or income eligibility is affected by these things, is really important to do prior to receiving the pension. So DSP is a little bit different, but again, probably the takeaway for this is, if you have concerns, really important to have a discussion with a financial planner, a financial counsellor, and there's some information on our website about that, or you can have a conversation with the Financial Information Service through Centrelink, and they can kind of point you in the right direction as well. A lot of this stuff is on the Services Australia website if you go and you have a little bit of a search for that. But also, if there's any, I don't see any questions in the chat box, but if you do have a particular question that's come up out of this, or we didn't answer your question in what you sent through to us, again, might have been because your circumstance was very specific. So if you're wanting some support or some information around that, please contact our Ask COTA information service, and we'll point you in the right direction. I will preface that with, we have I think beginning next week, we're going to have some limited capacity over the next couple of weeks just because of staff leave. So it might take a little bit longer for us to get back to you than usual. So that the information about that again is on the website. So hopefully people have what they need there. I believe the link to that was put on earlier in the chat. But we don't have any other questions that are popping up, Steve, no? Oh, yeah, I see Steve's just put in the planning ahead resources, which is around the powers of attorney information. All right, well, I think no questions. We'll kind of finish up there. Thank you, Kelly. Really appreciate your time. I think sometimes lack of questions means you've done your job in everyone knows what's what in terms of the funeral planning space. So that's fantastic.
Oh, that's good. No, but no one accuses me of lack of being able to talk.
Probably very important skill to have in your role. But yes, thank you so much, and Pleasure. Thank you everyone who's joined us today. We've got a number of other events going on throughout the whole Seniors Festival. Check out COTA's website to see if any of those are of interest to you. But otherwise, I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day today, and we've got some nice Melbourne weather at the moment, so if you're around, enjoy that.